attention, press 0. What are you talking about?
Hello everyone. So for today's discussion, we would be talking about the raiders of the Sulu Sea. This topic is one of the things or one of the topics that we haven't discussed when you were in our basic education. So I just hope that you sit back, relax, and enjoy watching and listening to this humbling video. Disclaimer! The PowerPoint used in this vlog was made by Mr. Ryan D. Biong and Mr. Hezekiah A. Concepcion. They're just two of my able co-trainees when we had our readings in Philippine history training at De La Salle University last October 2016. So without further ado, let's start. Let's start with the producer of the film Raiders of the Sulu Sea. So as you can see, it was produced by Oak Tree Films. I don't know if you could still see it. The founder, Zahirat Banu, CEO with Lim Suwat Hien, the COO. And I think one of the things that you have to know is that this Oak Tree entered the international market in 2003. And they are more into producing documentaries, educational films, telemovies, corporate films with film companies from different countries throughout years. So this Raiders of the Sulu Sea under Oak Tree Films is a product of a co-production agreement between Media Authority of Singapore and Korean Broadcasting Commission. So it was first released in 2007 for Q Channel and distributed internationally by Looking Glass International, through Discovery Channel and History Channel for Asia in 2008. So the running time, it's actually 48 minutes and 43 seconds, and it was directed by Mr. Idzwan Othman. I just hope that I pronounce it correctly. This historical documentary, The Raiders of the Sulu Sea, is about the slave raiding activities perpetrated by the Sama Balangingi, or as they say, Samal Balangingi, and the Ilanon or Iranon, under direction of the Sultanate of Sulu, which at the time was headed by the Tausug clan. So to make these documentary credible and reliable, the authorities behind this documentary film used key informants. And as follows were the key informants in this documentary film. We have Aisel D. Borja, Dr. Samuel K. Tan, Dr. Barbara W. Andaya, Dr. Julius Bautista, Dr. Margarita D. Cujanco, and Mr. Halman Abubakar. Our first informant, we have Miss Aisel Gloria Dorano Borja, who was born in Zamboanga City. One of the notable things with regards to her bloodline is that she's a 7th generation direct descendant of Vicente Alvarez, the hero of Zamboanga City during the Spanish-American War. With regards to her educational background, she earned her first degree at the Western Mindanao State University, finished her bachelor in science, major in home economics, and pursued her second degree at the UP College of Fine Arts, major in art history. She is undoubtedly a collector of art, and we could say that presently she's a cultural worker as a research associate of the National Museum, and for many years as curator of art museum exhibits here and abroad. Our second informant, we have Dr. Samuel K. Tan, who is a Sama Tausug Chinese Filipino born in Siasi, Sulu, who earned his MA History degree in UP Diliman and his PhD in Interdisciplinary Studies in Syracuse University, New York, USA. He is a published author and serves as chair of University of the Philippines, Diliman, Department of History. He is an authority on the issue of Moro history, armed struggle, and quest for self-determination. Like many historians from the South, he shares the view that the colonial depiction of Moro slave raiding in Philippine coastal towns were a demonstration of armed resistance to colonial rule. Our third informant, we have Mr. Halman Abubakar, who is a Tausug, and at the time, he was a town councilor of Hulo, Sulu, and a member of the educated Abubakar clan of Hulo. He shares the sentiment of his people, the Tausug, and the Moro community in general, who resents their characterization by Western colonial and Filipino historiography as pirates. He asserts that the attacks on Spanish forces were the Moro reaction to Spanish and American impositions on the Moro people. He promotes the indigenous martial arts of silat, pencaksilat in Malay, as a form of self-defense and glorifies the historic and symbolic significance of the Tausug bladed weapons. These are the barong and the kris, which in Tausug they call it kalis. Our fourth informant, we have Dr. Barbara Watson-Andaya, a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii and director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. When it comes to her educational background, she finished her MA in History at the University of Hawaii, and she subsequently went on to study for her PhD at Cornell University with a specialization in Southeast Asian history. Our fifth informant, we have Dr. Julius Bautista, who finished his PhD in Australian National University's Center for Asian Societies and History under the supervision of Dr. Reynaldo C. Ileto in 2004. And finally, we have Dr. Margarita Tintin Cojuangco, who finished her PhD in History at University of Santo Tomas, where she researched on the history of the Sama or Samal in Sulu Archipelago. To start with, we have to know the raiders of the Sulu Sea. Who are the raiders of the Sulu Sea? So according to Dr. Samuel Kaitan and other historians or authorities, these are three groups of people who were deemed to be raiders of the Sulu Sea. First one, we have the Tausug, or this group of people at that time were known to be fierce warriors and had a widespread political power. While the other two, we have Sama Bangini, the second one, and then the third one, we have the Iranons or the Ilanons, were considered to be great in terms of marine force or maritime navigation. The Iranons or the Ilanons were specifically portrayed as merciless in this historical documentary film. So as you could see in the screen, we have this fourth pillar. So fourth pillar, or known to be as Real Fuerza de Nuestra Señora del Pilar de Zaragoza. So in short, the fourth pillar. So this is considered to be the intramuros in the south. So as you all know, forts like this is for protection or for security of those people living inside, away from those enemies who would be eventually attacking, if there would be enemies who would be attacking. So Spaniards they built as such, so one of which is actually fourth pillar. So fourth pillar, fun fact, it's the second fort that the Spaniards or the Spanish built in the Philippines. The first one, it was in definitely Fort Santiago in 1571. So this one, the second fourth pillar, the third Cuyo Fort, and then we also have the fourth one. We have in Cebu the San Pedro Fort, or Fort of San Pedro, and the fifth one I forgot. But these forts were actually used by the Spaniards as a fortress for them to be somehow safe from their enemies. So this is actually how the fort looks like, and this is the entrance, as you could see there. Then we have this one, this space, it's here, the quadrangle, and then we have this one. This is actually a shrine, still existing up until now. So at this point, we will be talking about the content, but it would just be a brief summary of this documentary film. So as follows would be the highlights of the documentary film as interpreted by the authors of the PowerPoint presentation I've used and agreed upon by myself. So without further ado, let us start. First one, this historical documentary film addresses Moro resistance versus Spanish and American rules in Southern Philippines. As you all know, we are being colonized by the Spaniards and then Americans. And even though we had this independence, we gained independence from Spain, and we were still colonized by Americans, still the Moro resistance done by our brothers down in Southern Philippines still continued. So it's actually a manifestation that our brothers there, our Moro brothers there, resisted Spanish and the American forces. The second one, the Moro slave raiding raids on coastal areas demonstrated resistance versus Spanish rule. So as we all know, the said slave raiding boomed or climaxed in the 18th century until 19th century, but still, even though we were already colonized by the Americans, still this slave raiding raid continued. But going back, as I've said, these Moro raids on coastal areas demonstrated resistance. This was actually, as I've said, a manifestation that they don't like the Spanish rule. They don't want to be asked that they would be converted into Christianity, because we all know that their faith or their belief or their religion is actually Islam, and it would be very difficult for these missionaries or even the Spaniards as a whole to convert our Muslim brothers and sisters to go convert themselves into Christianity. The third one, here in this documentary film, the story of the much feared Dalasi attacked in December 1720 in Fort Pilar, Zamboanga. Unfortunately, that attack by Dalasi failed because of the jealousy and betrayal of his own brother. Then fourth one, these slave raidings were sanctioned by the Sultan for political and economic motives. If I say Sultan, the one who's actually into office or holding or managing or heading these slave raiders was actually coming from the clan of the Tausug. Because as we've mentioned earlier, if we say Tausug, these are a group of people who had widespread political power at that time. So it was then at that time considered legal. Okay, but for other historiographers or historians, specifically Western historiography and even Filipino historiography, they consider the slave raiders as pirates. So it's actually a matter of perspectives on how you define these raiders of the Sulu Sea. The fifth one, we have this Spanish policy. They would like to stopping the raids, but they would like to participate and monopolize trade. So they would like to stop the trades, but they would like to participate this activity and would like to monopolize trade. So what do you think would be the reason why they would like to participate and monopolize trade? So they really see at the time, or they observed at the time, that this one, it's actually something that puts money on their table. So they would really like to participate and even monopolizing the trade. That's why they would like to stop the raidings made by this Moro slave raiders. And at the same time, the policy that was given to all the Filipinos at the time is to propagate Christianity. And as I've mentioned, if you would have to force them this Christianity for our Muslim brothers and sisters, it would be difficult for them because they are loyal to their belief or to their faith or to their religion. Okay, the sixth one, slave raiding was part of the bigger regional trade in islands of Southeast Asia. So we won't be saying that slave raiding was actually contained here in the Philippines, and the slave raiders were only victimizing the Filipinos in Mindanao. But no, actually they went beyond Visayas and even the northern Philippines, but actually not just in the Philippines, beyond Philippines actually. So they went also as far as Malaysia, Borneo, and even in Indonesia, wherein there was this line used by the raiders of the Sulu Sea. It states, or it says, there is a difficulty in catching fish, but it is easier to catch the Bornean. So there, I think that statement says it all already. So seventh, Moro defiance against American imposition dramatized resistance versus American rule, as it's manifested in the Budaho incident that happened in 1906 and the Budbagsak in 1913. I think these were the things that President Duterte showed or presented to Barack Obama when he was still the president of the United States of America, where the two were actually invited. So I think these pictures of the Budaho and the Budbagsak were actually shown when Duterte was actually being given the floor to say something, and these were the pictures that were actually shown to the gathering, wherein one of which were there, or who was there, was Mr. Barack Obama. And lastly, the colonial rule and armed conflicts in this region caused the impoverishment of Muslim areas. So as you could see, if we say the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao, it is one of the places here in the Philippines deemed to be still impoverished. But if you would have to look the story or the history of this place, it was a very rich place or area before. So what happened? So it only proves that if a certain place there's no peace and order, and at times there's an armed conflict, really the people of the area would be definitely be affected by these conflicts, armed conflicts, and even before the colonial rule. It is to note also that the slave raiders use slave raiding vessels that in no time cannot be matched by the Spanish vessels. Well, of course, until the introduction of the steam engine boats that were ordered by the then Spanish Governor General Narciso Claveria. But before that, there was really this period wherein Spaniards cannot really match the how do you call this one? The speed of the boats or the vessels used by the slave raiders. The three slave raiding vessels that were commonly used by the raiders of the Sulu Sea were as follows. We have the Jungas or the Lanong. This is actually the biggest among the three vessels that were used by the slave raiders. We have the Garay. The Garay is considered to be the fastest of the three, which carries around 60 to 80 men depending on the size of the Garay. But according to accounts, there were also Garays which carry 30 to 40 men. And then we have the smallest vessel that was used by the raiders, and this boat or vessel was commonly used in checking or monitoring the coastal areas, which seems if you are in the coastal area, you would be thinking that these are not actually the raiders, but it's just fellow fishermen who were actually fishing in the coastal areas. But actually these are the raiders already boarding the smallest boat sa lisipan. Kind of vessels that were used by the raiders was a clear proof that there was this quote-unquote maritime civilization, and it's based on the 1977 archaeological findings from Butuan. So under this period also, there was they built seaworthy vessels navigated by adept sailors in a labor-intensive economy that bartered birds' nests, tripang. If you say tripang, these are sea cucumbers and pearls. At that time, also slaves work as gatherers, rowers, and even helpers. Hence, slave raiding, sale and distribution was considered a part of international trade in Southeast Asia. And if I would have to add, it's not just in Southeast Asia. According to James Francis Warren, an author of The Global Economy and the Sulu Zone, Connections, Commodities, and Culture, it's not just in Southeast Asia, but also beyond Southeast Asia, which is actually China, referring to China, and even Europe. So Europe go gaga on teas, and teas were actually available in China. And in China, they lack laborers or farmers who would have to till the land or would have to plant and take care of the tea. So they wanted slaves. And in that matter, they saw Philippines, specifically the Sulu Sultanate, who could provide them the slaves that they would be needing in their farm. So in return, the Sulu Sultanate would have to get products made in China and even products made in Europe. So the weapons that you could see on the screen are the weapons used by the raiders of the Sulu Sea. So we have the kalis or kris or barong, usually used by the Tausugs. The curvy sword-like weapon, that's the kalis or kris, and the other one, it's barong, usually used in a close counter battle. While for the kampilan, this is actually used by the Ilanon or Iranon and even the Sama Bangingi. And I think one of important thing here, it's ornate, which is actually the human hair, in which they say it could also intimidate the enemy having this human hair. So well, we would have to think that these human hairs were actually coming from the dead bodies of the one which killed this kind of weapon, kampilan. So that's kampilan, to decapitate the opponent and could use to extract the opponent's head. The slave raiding activities done by the Sulu raiders was not just in the 18th century but prior to that. But the difference is before the 18th century, it was not that rampant in terms of slave raiding until when the participants of this activity increased. This made the slave raiding activity boom. And it so happened that the Europeans, at the same time the Chinese, would like to get slaves coming from those taken by the Sulu Sultanate or the Sulu raiders. So these were centuries ago, the slave raiding activity were centuries ago, but as time went by, this slave raiding activities was put into hold because of this secret weapon used by the Spaniards. And if I mentioned earlier that the secret weapon used by the Sulu raiders were actually the vessels used by them, because it's too fast that the Spaniards cannot really outwit the vessels used by them. So this was actually the thing that the Spaniards thought about, and the Governor General who thought about it was actually Spanish Governor General Narciso Claveria, who thought that they would have to use the steamships introduced by the British. So they bought steamships and used it against the Sulu raiders, and it went successful. So successful in the sense that there was this destruction of Balangini settlement in 1848. But we have to remember that these raiders, they're not just working because of their religion or their faith, but you could also see here their struggle to fight for their freedom, and they would like to preserve their identity over oppression and subjugation of these forces, specifically the Spanish. In 1848, as I mentioned, there was this destruction of Balangini. At the time, Spain, with its acquisition of these powerful steamships from Britain, succeeded in gradually ending slave raiding before 1898. So they destroyed Balangini settlements in Tongkil Island. Now it's the Balangini municipality. At the time, the fierce leader of the Sulu Raiders was Panglima Taupan, who eventually surrendered after his wife and kids were taken captives by Spanish forces. So they were relocated to Zamboanga. Hopefully, after watching this historical documentary film, Raiders of the Sulu Sea, produced by Octree Films, you could also go directly to my description, as you could find there the link to see or to watch the documentary produced by Octree Films, for you to understand better who really and what really were the Raiders of the Sulu Sea back then.